I forgot to
late.
get a thing of water.
Okay.
Well, it said Barclays.
Too late.
No, hold on. Let me grab some.
But you
Let me
have-
grab
yeah,
my water.
Yeah, of course. So I'm checking that we are actually live. Okay, great. Okay, so we are waiting for Asia. Just a minute and she will be here. In the meanwhile, hello everyone. So, okay, you're here, great. But it's okay, you gave me just the time to say hello everyone. So this is the fifth interview actually of the initiative 2 weeks of databases. So today we have an interview with the greatest member of the MongoDB team, Asya Kamsky.
The greatest one who agreed to be live at this hour. You could hear me before.
I can't hear you. I suspect you're muted.
No, I changed nothing. Test. You're right. Test. I am not muted. I literally changed nothing. When you went live, something changed because I just set down my headphones and I came back. Oh, it's going to be hard for me to be clever if I'm muted.
I see you're talking, but I have no idea what you're saying.
Oh, you know what? The live comments say that they can hear me. So maybe it's remember how when you connected, you couldn't hear me? You couldn't hear me before, so maybe it's the same thing. Audience says they can hear me.
Okay, the only thing... Okay, I see that people can hear us, but
I know.
If I can't hear you, it's a bit of a problem.
I know.
So give me 1 minute because I need to restart at least my browser and see if it works. Sorry for the problem. It will be just a minute.
Otherwise, it'll be me doing a monologue. Can you guys hear me with just me? Because I'll just do a monologue rather than a duet or an interview. That'd be pretty funny, right? You guys tuned in to hear an interview, and by the way, when I got on at first, Federico's sound was not there. Yeah, I'm going to tell you a joke. Yeah, so his sound wasn't. He couldn't hear me, and he changed something on his side and was able to hear me. So I wondered if it was the same thing. I was just telling jokes.
Thanks for explaining and taking the time while I was away. Thanks. I restarted the browser. Now I can hear you. So
it's the universal PC solution, right? Have you tried restarting it?
Of course.
Turning it off and on.
Yes, I call it Windows 95 solution.
Exactly. One of my closest friends, when her daughter was 6 or 7, and they were doing some drawing programs at the elementary school, she came home and she says, Mommy, when I was doing the drawing program today, my program froze. And so I pushed the button to make the computer go dark, and then I pushed the button again to make it come back, and then I was able to draw no problem. So she turns to me, her mother does, and she says, she starts with our IT department on Monday.
Yeah, I think if it works, it's the right solution.
Exactly.
So, first of all, I wanted to ask you, in which part of the world you are currently?
I'm currently in New York City.
Oh, okay.
In my apartment, where I have been not sequestered, that's not the right word, sheltered in place.
Okay.
We've our whole company has been working from home for almost 2 months because of the pandemic. For those who are watching this much later, it's early May. What are you in Italy?
No, no, I am Italian, but I live in London.
In London. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, you're having the same problem. I'm originally
Yes.
Russian. So your name's Italian, my name is Russian, because that's
Yeah.
where we're originally from. And now you're in London and I'm in New York.
Yeah. It's a word that until now allowed traveling, and I hope that it will be allowed again.
Me too. Me too. I love travel.
Okay, so I wanted to, first of all, let you introduce yourself and maybe talk us a bit about who you are and what your background is.
Sure. My name is Asya Kamsky. I work for MongoDB currently. I started out I started out in computer graphics actually, but then I somehow fell into a job at a database company, like almost 30 years ago, I'm scared to say. And ever since then, I've been working with databases. And the first, I'd say about, 15 years of that was, of course, with relational databases. I've worked with just about all of them, except I maybe like miss DB2 and one other one, but all the other major ones I've worked with. Some way back when they were very different looking databases, some more recently. And then in about not quite 10 years ago, but almost 10 years ago, somebody was like, hey, what do you think about this NoSQL thing? And I'm like, I know SQL. What do you mean? And I found out that because my last job before MongoDB, I kind of tried to get away from databases a little bit. I worked for a static analysis company. And I was like, hey, what happened in the few years I wasn't paying attention? All of a sudden, like the whole database world revolutionized itself in some way, shape, or form. And I tried MongoDB. I was working on a project at that point that it was just migrating a bunch of knowledge-based data from like one system to another system. And I was just going to, dump it all out as like XML files and then load them into some other system via some, REST API or something. And I went, oh, well, I've heard about this MongoDB thing. Let me just like download it, run it locally, and I'll load the data into that. So I'll play around with it and find out what it's like. Cause I'm always like trying new things because it's fun. And so I worked on this project for almost a week. It wasn't that, big of a thing. But at the end of it, I was like really mad because I felt like I didn't learn anything about MongoDB. I never had to like look under the hood. Coming from like the backend and DBA side, I always felt like, well, if you're running a database, you're going to have to go and learn about how to configure it and how to do some under the hood things. And here I was like, I didn't learn anything because I didn't have to do anything with it. But it turns out, of course, that I did learn something, which is I learned why developers were so excited about using it, because it felt like it stayed out of my way. Right. I was coding things in Python. I just installed PyMongo, which was the driver that essentially just translated my objects, my dictionaries, my lists of dictionaries into sets of documents that then it persisted to the database, that then when I got back, they looked like Python objects again. And, a lot of times people say like, oh, MongoDB was just popular because they, spammed the universe with blah, blah, blah marketing. And I'm like, no, it's, I totally get it now. It's developers who were like, oh my God, it was so easy to get started with, told all of their friends, and they told all of their friends, and they told all of their friends, et cetera, et cetera. Right. Well, because the fact is that, after using SQL for 20 years, it didn't really, you forget how it was before you were comfortable with something like a new language or a new concept. And so you're like, well, how hard is it? Just learn SQL. But, one person's programming in Java, another person's programming in Python or Ruby or Perl or whatever, right? And you're telling them that they have to learn essentially a text-based language and somehow cram it into their code. And their code for all of them looks different, but SQL is going to look the same. And it's a mismatch, right? Even though you only have to learn SQL once per flavor of SQL that you're using, depending on which database you're using, right? And so I totally got why developers, using a driver was suddenly like, oh my God, I'm so much more productive, right? And this is the same reason why, even though SQL is relatively easy to learn, backend developers still all like to use different, ORMs so that they don't have to like think, switch how they think about things, right?
Yeah.
Of course, as a former DBA and data architect, I'll be the first ones to yell at developers who don't think about what happens in the database. But I realized that if developers are not going to think about what happens to their data, it's a tiny little bit safer if their data looks exactly like their objects in their code. But it's bad either way. I still tell developers, you have to think about what happens to your data and how you want to use it. It's a bit of a myth that those things aren't concepts with MongoDB. Anyway, so I joined, at the time they were called 10gen. As you can tell, I'm extroverted and somewhat, like to socialize with people and tell them how to do stuff. I stay up all nights because somebody's wrong on the internet somewhere. And so I was not very happy being a developer, which is what I was for like the first 15 years of my career. And I found that you could be super technical while being in the field, just like you can be being a developer. It's not about who's more technical, who's less technical. It's more about who likes to sit at their desk and think deep about one problem and solve that, versus who, like me, likes to work on 17 different things at once and hop from thing to thing. So I joined MongoDB when it was a lot smaller than it is now, as one of the first people in the field. So I did consulting, I did training, I did pre-sales, post-sales, conference talks, QA right before releases, because back then we didn't have much dedicated any department. Now, of course, it's much, much bigger. So a few years after starting, I moved over to product management. I was a product manager for the query and storage engines for a few years, then just query as we grew. And because that's kind of my favorite part, right? That the query API, MQL, that's how you talk to the database. So it's kind of cool trying to connect that in my brain with, what code looks like versus what the commands to the database look like. And then I also did some DevRel, and now I'm kind of a special department of one. I'm I guess the title is like principal engineer, office of the CTO. I'm very strongly aligned both with the product team and with our DevRel team. So I want to make sure what we're communicating to engineering is right, that they can focus their resources on the right thing. And then I want to make sure that what we communicate to developers out there is also right, so that they're not using MongoDB for things that it's not a good fit for, and are more successful using it for things that it is a good fit for.
Great. First of all, I'm happy that you are extrovert, because, as you said, because I want to keep this series of interviews as informal as possible, and I want to be friendly, and I'm not a formal person anyway.
Good.
So that's great, because I can ask you what's in my mind since a couple of days. If I look at your LinkedIn profile, the photo I see, is it you in a luggage compartment?
Yes, it is. Yes. Thank you for noticing. Sometimes people go, "Why do you have a picture of you in a tanning salon?" And I'm like, I'm wearing a sweater, and yeah, it's it was not in flight. This was I'm having been a frequent flyer and loving travel for years and years. I've gone to a number of frequent flyer events that airlines have hosted. This was hosted by Continental in Houston in their hangar. And they were showing us the newly reconfigured interior 757. It was in the hangar, like it was not, going anywhere at the moment. Yeah. And at some point, somebody is like, "Oh, I want to get into the overhead luggage compartment," because they say that they had the largest overhead compartments in the sky at the time. And they did. And as soon as we saw that somebody got a picture like that, we all had to be like, "Oh, I want a picture like that too." And so when people say, how did you get up there? I go, well, the flight attendant who was working the tour helped me out, right? You get on the seat, then you stand on the arm, and then somebody has to give you a hand while you swing your leg inside. So not at all work related. I was not debugging a problem or anything like that.
Good, because it would be quite scary to debug problems in a flying plane.
Trust me. Once I realized that software runs everything, including a lot of our, flying related things, it made me kind of like, oh, yikes.
Okay, so I want to tell you that I believe that most of the people who is watching us, or maybe will watch us later, comes mostly from relational databases. So during this interview, I will make you some objections about MongoDB that are not necessarily my objections, because
Sure.
I actually believe in using the right tool for the right purpose.
Me
but
too.
They could be, but they could be objections from people who believe in relational databases and maybe doesn't like some NoSQL approaches. So you can have the opportunity to answer these typical objections, right?
Sure.
And while I do this, people who watch us on YouTube has a chat, so they are not only allowed but very welcome to ask questions, and I will probably forward some of these questions to Asia. So feel free. So let's start from the basics. Do you want to talk us a bit about MongoDB data model and how to use it properly?
Sure. I guess the two questions, one of them is a lot more easily answered than the other. The data model is documents in the sense of JSON documents, right? So in different language, it might look different. So for example, in Python, which was my preferred language, it's dictionaries, right? In JSON, it's JSON objects. You have a document of key value pairs, right? So each field has a key name and some value, and the value could be scalar, or the value could be a complex type. It could be itself a subdocument, right? Just like a dictionary can have a key and a value that's another dictionary, or it could be a value that's another list. All right, they're associative arrays or hashes or objects or whatever your language calls a complex data structure or data object. And MongoDB doesn't actually store JSON, even though it looks like JSON. It's actually BSON, which is a binary format. It has a few advantages over JSON in that it supports a number of data types that JavaScript doesn't support. For example, in JavaScript, all numbers are floats basically, and MongoDB supports obviously various long int, short, regular int, decimal, double, etc. There's a bunch of other data types that we have to add because that's expected that your data will have a bunch of other data types, right? So a document roughly corresponds to a row in a database table. In MongoDB, we call them collections. Collections tables pretty much interchangeable. But each document, unlike a row, which is flat for the most part, right? There are SQL extensions that support arrays. They're not that widely used or supported because generally, if you think of something as being tabular, each column, which corresponds to a field, can have a single value, right? And that's why, in relational databases a long time ago, we started by adding like blobs. Just put anything in there, like some binary thing, and you can get it back, right? That's more akin to a really simplistic key value store where you have a primary key and then the value. And that value is just the thing you get back. You can only get it back by primary key, right? So every data store has, its take on things, right? MongoDB's take is your objects, your database entities that you store don't have to be flat and they don't have to be uniform. So the primary difference is you can store anything in the database like with a simple key value store, but we've kept a lot of concepts that are very useful from relational databases, such as you don't just have to access things by primary key, right? You can index other fields, like having an index on a column in a relational database, and indexes are still B trees. So in that sense, indexes are very similar and familiar to people who are coming from relational world, right? And you can have compound indexes and covered indexes and sparse indexes, and all those concepts are very same and very familiar. But one of the biggest challenges that we always had with relational databases was the dynamic nature of data, right? The simplest example was always something like attributes, right? You have entities, let's say it's, people or something else. And initially you go, okay, and each person is going to have this attribute about them and that attribute about them. And then later you're like, oh, but like we want to be able to add attributes dynamically, right? Or as they come in, just store them, but then also query on them. And that's challenging with the relational database because either you have to decide how many attributes you can store with each person, you store them in a separate table, then you have to somehow, join it to the original table, or you have a generic, attribute name, attribute value fields, which then makes it difficult to query by multiple different attributes. So I spent enough years in relational databases that I actually dealt with trying to solve all these problems. So the first time I used MongoDB, I'm like, oh, I get it. I understand the pain in the data model that it was trying to solve, right? And then the other side of it is, of course, operational. So it's the differentiator with MongoDB is like from the start, it was conceived as databases are not pets, they're cattle. I don't know if you've ever heard that analogy, right? Pets you don't have very many of, and when they get sick, you go to the vet and you nurse them to health because they're an integral part of your family, right? Cattle you might have thousands of, and if one of them gets sick, you get rid of it before it gets the rest of the cattle sick and just replace it with a new one, right? And I think Google was probably the first ones that, back when they were getting started, I was at a company called eGreetings, where we had a massive $1 million database, and it was on this massive $1 million server in a colo facility. And when we'd go there to nurse it, we would see like Google was setting up like cages and cages of these boxes and each box held like dozens of computers. And I was like, well, that's a very different approach, right? And at the time we were thinking of that as the approach, to the front end, right? The taking connections, because you have so many people coming in. But of course, it should work with database as well. You should be able to scale the databases the same way you scale all the other parts of the system. And so that's why, both replication and for high availability and sharding for horizontal partitioning was kind of from the very beginning architected into MongoDB. So that's like kind of the other big differentiator.
Okay. Based on what you said I totally agree that it's good to be able to add an attribute without having to make a massive operation like alter table in relational databases. But two possible objections are being able to change the schema so easily or not having a schema at all also means that it is easy to make a mistake in your code and then produce bad data. And a similar but not exactly the same objection is that it is easy to make mistakes in the design and then produce bad data on purpose and realize it is bad only later.
Sure.
What would you answer?
So the second one of those problems absolutely 100% exists in all databases, including relational databases, right? Bad design that doesn't capture the data in a way that you were anticipating, you were able to, basically bad code, bad design, that's universal. I used to work for a company that relied on that fact. But the fact is that if you the problem that we're trying to solve that you mentioned, right? The whole, how do you not get bad data in, is you can prevent it from getting in by writing perfect code up front, which nobody does. That's literally humanly not possible, right? So then you have kind of a choice of where you accept the imperfection that we frequently generate, that we call new features, right? And how you deal with fixing it and improving it. And some of the examples I sometimes see people give as, well, this is what's going to happen if you don't, enforce this or that. I mean, I did one of those in my very first project that I mentioned, where I was querying where number of comments in the form, for some blog posts or whatever I was moving over, is greater than or equal to 5. And then there was one that I wasn't getting back, and I'm like, I could see it's 5. Why am I not getting? Oh, because 5 was somehow a string. Instead of being a number, it was a string. Bad data. It got in there. When querying, I couldn't see it.
Yeah.
If the database prevented it from getting in, then it would be lost, because then it would never be saved in the database to begin with. The database would refuse to accept it. And then could I act on that at the time? It's like, well, no, I guess it depends what the error was, right? Maybe the server would crash because it wouldn't expect an error from the database at that time. Or maybe it would write an error to the logs and continue going. And then to find that bad data, you can't even query the database. You have to go and look for some old logs, or maybe it would just throw away the data, right? And so a lot of times what I see people doing, and now in MongoDB, you can enforce a schema. There are a number of ways of specifying, we call a document validation, right? You can specify either like a query expression that says like, these fields must exist, and these must be string, and these must be greater than 5. And, as of like 3.6, I think, which was a few years ago, you could specify it as a JSON schema, which is a fairly well-known standard. And you have the ability to say, these fields are required, these fields must be these types. But also keep in mind, if you're using a strongly typed language, you're not going to get the wrong types into these fields, right? Because they would never have gotten into the data structure. And if you're using a language like, let's say, Python, where, you can have different fields have different types, even though they're like in the list of similar looking dictionaries, you already have to deal with this ambiguity in your code. What I found, so the very last really big system with the relational database in the back of it that I worked with, I was not part of the design. And what they did is it was Java, they used Hibernate. And once I did take a look at it, when I did get involved with it, I was kind of appalled that they were using none of the abilities of the relational database. They had no constraints on the database. And in cases where they did, like all of the checking was in the Hibernate layer. So I'm like, why did you even bother, getting a powerful relational database here if you're not using any of its features, right? They were letting Hibernate create these ridiculous, complex 43-way joins, right? And then they were like, hey, Asya, can you take a look at this? This is like really slow, and it feels like it should be a lot faster. I'm like, yeah, if you wrote good SQL to query it, it would be a lot faster. But, it's like if you delegate the enforcement for something into a layer, you sometimes have to accept that layer will also, keep you from using the tool to its, highest capabilities, right? And so in MongoDB, we just say that up front. Look, unless you use document validation, you're responsible for making sure that your data is shaped the way you want it to be shaped. But there's flexibility of saying, yeah, I'm going to accept these fields. And then for the rest of the, let's say, subdocument, I'm going to accept whatever the user gives. I'll store it. When they want it back, I'll give it back to them. Right. And when you query, you can have fairly complex queries to essentially to account for possibilities of different types and different shapes. So you can also use aggregation pipeline to reshape the documents. This is more akin to, I spent some years in data warehousing, more akin to ETL, right? You take the data from the source system in whatever format it's in, and then, the T for, transform and extract, transform, and load stands for actually cleanse and normalize, because you're getting it from different systems and they all have their own ideas about how to store different types and different formats. So we already had to deal with it in relational world. Here, it's upfront. The responsibility is on you, right? And not, the database is not going to save you unless you tell it exactly how you want it to save you.
Okay, I like a lot, especially one part of your answer, which is the one about accepting that what we're going to make is not perfect.
Never.
Because it's an answer that I never got while talking about these kind of things.
Every database. Let me tell you something. I was with a company, a startup. I worked mostly with startups in my whole career, and I was, employee number 4, and I knew both founders. But employee number 3, we had not worked together. We only knew of each other through the founder, who was a common friend. And when we first met, he asked me. He said, "Listen, I always wondered about this. Like, when you're creating a schema for like the first version of our product, how do you know it's going to be correct?" And I said, "Oh, I know for a fact it's going to be wrong." Because we have no idea what we're going to do as a company. We're going to build this thing, and then we're going to pivot because somebody's interested in just this tiny little piece of it down here, and I'm going to have to redo it all. But you just kind of you go along, and if you know that, you keep in mind the flexibility and the possibility. It doesn't matter what the data stores. You still have to account for, I may have to like redo this whole thing.
Yeah. There is a question from DB Demon. So there is the question, and then there is an evil smile at the end of the question. But I suspect that you have a better answer than he thinks. And the question is, maybe tell us how you do a join.
I don't think that's an evil smile. I think that's a wink. Like we're winking, like it's funny.
It could
right?
be. It's open to interpretation.
Well, so it's a fair question, right? To prefix the how you do a join question, you have to pretty much first say why you do a join, right? Mm-hmm. Depending on why you're doing a join, the answer might be different. One of the kind of canonical answers or canonical concepts we teach even non-technical people, like, for example, sales folks or less technical marketing folks, maybe, is, what does it mean that the data is in a document and it's not tabular? And we say, well, how in an Excel spreadsheet, if you have, like, let's say all of your employees or all of your friends, and then you have all of their phone numbers, it's in one column, right? Mm-hmm. But then you're like, oh, wait, I also want to have like a home and a cell phone number and a work number. But some people have 2 cell phones, and maybe there's some other types of phone numbers. And all of a sudden you're adding columns just to have like one person have a 5th phone number. And in relational, the answer is you store it in a separate table, in which case you have to do a join to get both the person and their phone numbers. So what I would say is, in the case of one to few, right, where one to many, where many is a limited number, it doesn't have to be a small number like 3 or 5. It could be a number like 90 or 100, but it has to be kind of a limited number, something that doesn't grow infinitely. In that case, you don't do a join, you instead embed the data, right? If you were using SQL with support for arrays, you would have a phone number as an array, which for some people might be empty, and for other people might have 8 values, right? And that value doesn't just have to be a number. It could be a little sub-document where type of phone, cell, and the number is the number or something like that. So it's the same reason why relational databases have had, most of them anyway, have had multi-document transactions, because inherent with the I've split my data into two separate tables is I have to be able to update both tables atomically, synchronously at the same time, all or nothing, right? If the same entity has its information in multiple tables and you want to make an update that updates two different but related things about it, you want to do it in a transaction. If it's in a single document, updating a document is already transactional, all or nothing, right? So in one of these cases, you don't need to do joins because you've co-located the related information in the same document. There are other cases where a join is essentially like a lookup of details of related information. Like in a data warehousing type, like if you think of a fact table with multiple dimensions are keys, but you don't want to display keys to the end user when you got your final results. You want to hydrate them with, the string that describes what that attribute is, for example, right? And that's kind of more of a lookup at the end of a pipeline for MongoDB. So that's a perfect use for an aggregation $lookup expression or stage, which essentially does the equivalent of, for each value, look up what its actual whatever attribute or string or description is. There are a lot of other situations, though, where joins are essentially a convenience of not having to ask the database for two different things. But when the application loads those things in sequential order, you can, I'll give an example of, let's say somebody logs in and you have to look up based on their user ID, whether they entered in the right password. And while you're in there, you grab other fields from the user table to show them like, welcome, such and such your name is, and you last logged in on such and such date, right? And now you're going to be loading other parts of the UI with, here's some additional information and here's some other additional information. But there's no reason why you have to go to all of those tables all at once to get that information in a single join when, while you're rendering their hello, such and such, and here's your latest whatever, you now also query like their most recent orders and show, let's say it was like an e-commerce system, and your most recent 3 orders are in this status, right? And as they scroll down, and here's the latest comments on your reviews or something else. So, a lot of times when you're writing the code, you don't actually do it in a way that maps to a join in a database. You do it in a way that maps into multiple queries to the database, right? So, the answer is sometimes you emulate a join, but a lot of times you just don't need it, right? People were using MongoDB for quite a few years before we had any kind of native support for either joins or transactional or multi-document transactions, which we do now, but people were using it pretty successfully before as well.
Okay. This actually leads us to the next question, which is,
sure.
Well, actually, I had a very long list of questions, but we are kind of out of time, so I will have on. Yeah, almost. So we have only one more question about MongoDB, which is the most uncomfortable. Can you tell us when not to use MongoDB?
So this is actually a pretty funny one because I always say blah, 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 the best tool for the job. But there are so many jobs for which you could use pretty much any data store, right? Yeah. Let's say that, it doesn't need any of the fancy features of either relational database or MongoDB and then what I tell people is they should use the one that they're most familiar with. Nobody should go and learn a whole new data store just because they're like, oh my God, what if someday I need XYZ, right? And a lot of times you may be prototyping things. If you're familiar with MongoDB, it's going to be absolutely a lot faster to prototype in MongoDB. But, if your production system and all of your production expertise is in relational databases and the once you've developed the app, it's a good fit for a relational database, right? You don't have, dynamic, fast changing data that's very unpredictable, right? And you don't need to query by it, right? Which means it can be stored in essentially equivalent of a blob of whatever format. You might be like, oh, we totally should use what we already have in production, or we should, use this fast key value store, right? I would say, like, there's a Venn diagram, right? There's data stores that have the features you need to get your job done, data stores that you know how to run and administer. And, obviously now with cloud offerings, that equation's changing a little bit, because you no longer need to know how to provision and configure and scale things like from the production sysadmin DBA side, right? But you still have to understand what indexes you need and how to create them, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. And so the intersection of, like, the thing that has the features you need, intersected with the ones that you know well enough to do a good job with, right? Intersected with, if you have a boss, what your boss says is approved for your company. Because sometimes sometimes the choice is not based on, oh, I would do the best, fastest job with this particular database, right? So, and I mean, it's certainly true that when somebody is first developing an app, they don't need to be thinking about, what if I become as popular as Amazon or as popular as Google and I have to scale to the world, right? But it is a good idea to kind of keep in the back of your mind, how well does this need to scale, right? How predictable is scaling? How easy will it be to, grow the capacity for it? There's really no right answer here, right? Yeah. There are sweet spots for very specialized database, certainly, but most relational databases, MongoDB, these are all general purpose databases. Like, for 80% of the cases, they're going to be fine, and you should use the one that you like best, or the one that's easiest to productize. One of the things that I loved when I first, learned MongoDB architecture is, like, oh, replications built in with automatic failover. Oh my God, like, whoever wants to carry a pager and be woken at 3:00 in the morning to, like, log in and manually figure out which slave to promote to be the new master. And developers, when I first joined, were telling me, like, oh, when you go out there to teach, like, admin stuff, developers love it, but admin people are going to hate you. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I've been the admin person. What admin person hates, automatic failover with it's like, and I think the idea was just that a lot of DBAs were kind of suspicious of anything new. And as soon as they realized that under the data model is different, but under the hood, it's kind of exactly the same. It still writes to a journal, right? You still have to know what physical capacity you're going to need to plan for it. So some of the best students graduating from those things were the ones who were experienced and knowledgeable database administrators, because those skills are completely transferable.
Okay. Yeah. I agree most of the things you said. I have a question not related to MongoDB.
Sure.
It is something I also asked yesterday to one of our interviewed persons, and it's, why are there so few women in technology?
That I think I've given, like, entire half hour, 40-minute talks or discussions about this, but I'm older than your average developer, and when I was in college and I graduated with a computer science degree, about 1/3 of my graduating class was women. And I just assumed it was going to keep going up until it got to about 50% and it would stay there. And instead it started dropping, and by, like, early 2000s, it was like 10% or something. And I think it corresponded to when, the .com bubble, Web 1.0, when a lot of money got into the industry, right? Remember, earliest computer programmers were all women because it was not a glamorous profession. So some of it is just kind of inherent sexism and power structures of, people who were in charge before expect that they'll be in charge of the new technology and the new companies as well. And some of it is computers became available not just to the nerds. And I say that affectionately. I'm a nerd, and so are all of my friends. Computers became available to everyone, and at younger age, possibly at an age when the sexes still haven't figured out how to get along, but already like, ooh, cooties, right? And I think there's kind of a combination. There's certainly some awful, awful stories out there. I have a colleague who was in marketing, but he was incredibly sharp and got the technical concepts like really well. I'm like, did you study like technical field in college or something? She's like, no. When I took a computer class in high school, I loved it, but the teacher was like, those of you who are girls, don't bother continuing in this field. You'll never make it. And I'm like, is this person still teaching? Because I would like to kill them. I probably shouldn't say that on a recorded broadcast, but it just makes me so mad that we scared away, I don't know how many people from this industry who would have been phenomenal. They would have been happy in it. They would have been successful. But some old jerk somewhere told a whole bunch of people in who knows how many years of classes, like, girls shouldn't do this. And here we are, right? We're still trying to kind of make up for that. And by the way, MongoDB has a very, very impressive number of women in engineering in terms of like percentage wise. In particular, I'm very encouraged. Our new grad class every year is more and more at parity. Same for our interns. So, and we do have programs for mentoring and kind of underrepresented genders, underrepresented ethnicities, etc. I think that's also key, so people can see and have mentors and people they look up to, or people whose footsteps they want to follow in, who they can identify maybe a little more with.
Yeah. Well, you have a question from Vadim, who asks you if you still speak Russian.
Немножко, a little bit. Actually, in 2014, I went to Moscow with MongoDB, and we visited a couple of partners, a couple of larger users of MongoDB, and we had a meetup, which was hosted at Yandex. You could still find a video of it somewhere on YouTube. And I know a couple of people there had a bet going about whether I spoke a little Russian because my parents were Russian, but I was American, or because I was, originally from there, which of course I was. But what happens is if you learn technical things in English, you have no idea. It turns out in Russian, they just use English words, but pronounce it as, in Russian. The funniest one was when towards the end of the week, my Russian was starting to get better. But I tripped over something and I said to them, how do you say, client, как говорите client? And they said client, and I go, oh my God, if I don't know a Russian word, I'm just going to say the English word, but pronounce it like it's Russian.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, nice. So there is just a final question, which is something that I'm asking to all the persons I interview, and it's, okay, we're living in kind of sad times because, the reasons are quite clear. So we are forced to stay home, right? But this can also have some positive aspects. For example, we have a lot of time to read. So do you have a couple of books to suggest to the people who's watching us? And if possible, I ask you to suggest a book which is related to databases and another which is on any other topic you like.
Okay, so I'm not going to suggest a book on databases, and here's why.
Okay.
I feel like, I don't know, like there's so many articles and papers and kind of little mini ebooks on any specific topic that it's just like type a few keywords into Google and you start reading things, and anything that speaks to you that seems to make sense and break it down in a way you understand is probably the right thing to read on a technical topic. Okay. Right? I feel like for technical things, what speaks to me and what explains things well to the way I have a mental map about items may be completely wrong presentation of material for somebody else.
Okay.
Right. Now for just reading for enjoyment, it's a very different thing. And again, different people like different topics, but possibly because I have not the best world's attention span, which is why I like to work on many different things. I've really been preferring books that are, maybe collections of interesting stories. And a specific one that I want to mention to the audience is called Out of Their Minds. The subtitle is Lives and Discoveries of 15 Great Computer Scientists.
Okay.
And I like it for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, everybody likes a good pun or play on words. And out of their minds obviously refers both to, ideas. Like here's somebody who thought of an idea and out of that came a whole concept, right? But of course, out of their minds is also an expression in English that we use to say that somebody's crazy, right? Oh, this person is out of their mind. How could they?
Yeah.
And a lot of times new inventions and new discoveries appear crazy, right? A couple hundred years, somebody said, man can fly, and be like, you're insane. Thank you very much. We're going to lock you up, right? And I think that, the magic of technology, advanced enough technology should be indistinguishable from magic, right? Can't remember if it was Arthur C. Clarke that said that, or as one of the science fiction writers, right? And so, to me, the most fascinating reading is about people and times when something came about. I'm sure that there will be many books on the times we ourselves lived through, right? The rise of the computer and the internet, and the computers shrinking into little devices that we have with us at all times. And how in the world did we find our way around before we had, a device in our hands that told us where to go, when to be there, and how to get there, right? So that's why the book that Out of Their Minds, you should be able to just Google that and find it on like Amazon or somewhere.
Great. I enjoyed this interview a lot, not
I'm
just
glad.
because of the topic, but also because you really think outside the box, and it's something I enjoy because you can say more interesting things.
Oh, I never thought of it as outside the box. I just, but yeah, good.
I think you do. So before closing, I want to remind everyone that this interview is part of 2 weeks of databases initiative, which will continue on Monday with an interview to Marco Macchiela from MariaDB. Later, 1 hour later, at 4 p.m., we will have a micro interview with another person from MariaDB, which is Andrew Hutchins. And basically, he has interesting ideas to share about communities, how they should work, and also some interesting experience about burnout. Tuesday, we will have Peter Zaitsev, CEO and founder of Percona. Then we will have Richard Heap, SQLite author. Then we will have Konstantin Osipov from ScyllaDB. And then on Friday, we will finish the series with Monty Vidinius, the creator of MySQL and MariaDB. So for now, thank you again, Aja. It was really a great time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I hope to talk to you again soon.
Well,
and to everyone, see you next Monday.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye.